The first time I saw Karen's silver SUV parked on my front lawn, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe she was having car trouble, or perhaps there was some emergency that required her to pull onto my grass. I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood, where people generally respect each other's property, so I decided to give her the benefit of the doubt. I grabbed my morning coffee and stepped outside, planning to politely ask if everything was okay. "Excuse me," I called out as Karen emerged from her vehicle, her designer handbag swinging confidently at her side. She was probably in her mid-40s, with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of aggressive confidence that immediately put me on edge. "Is everything all right? I noticed you parked on my lawn." Karen turned to face me with an expression that could only be described as incredulous. "Your lawn?" she scoffed, adjusting her oversized sunglasses despite the overcast morning. "This isn't your lawn. This is public parking." I blinked, certain I had misheard her. "I'm sorry, what? This is definitely my property. I have the deed. I pay the property taxes, and I've been living here for 3 years. I gestured toward the obvious property line marked by a small decorative fence that separated my yard from the sidewalk. "Listen here," Karen said, her voice rising to that particular pitch that entitled people use when they're about to make your life difficult. "I've been parking here for weeks while visiting my friend Margaret across the street. Margaret told me this was public land, and I have every right to park here. You can't just claim ownership of grass." The absurdity of the situation was almost comedic, but the deep tire tracks her SUV had left in my previously pristine lawn were very real. I'd spent the better part of last spring reseeding that area after a harsh winter, and now there were ugly brown gouges where her tires had pressed into the soft earth. "Ma'am, I understand there might be some confusion, but this is absolutely my property," I said, trying to maintain my composure. "The property line is clearly marked, and you're about 6 feet onto my lawn. I'm going to have to ask you to move your car." Karen's face flushed red, and she took a step closer to me, invading my personal space in a way that felt deliberately intimidating. "Are you threatening me? Because I'll have you know that I am friends with the mayor, and I won't be bullied by some nobody who thinks they can intimidate a woman." "I'm not trying to intimidate anyone," I replied, my patience already wearing thin. "I'm simply asking you to move your car off my property. It's really that simple." But Karen was just getting started. She pulled out her phone and began dramatically dialing, speaking loudly enough for the entire neighborhood to hear. "Yes, police? I'd like to report a harassment situation. There's a man here who's trying to prevent me from parking in a public area, and he's being very aggressive and threatening." I stood there in stunned silence as she provided a completely fabricated version of our interaction to whoever was on the other end of the line. According to Karen's narrative, I had approached her aggressively, used threatening language, and was attempting to illegally prevent her from using public parking. The creativity of her lies was almost impressive, if it weren't so infuriating. After ending her call, Karen smiled smugly and crossed her arms. "The police are on their way, and when they get here, they're going to tell you exactly what I'm telling you now. This is public property, and I have every right to park here. Maybe you should have done your research before trying to hassle innocent people." 20 minutes later, Officer Rodriguez arrived in his patrol car, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. I could tell from his expression that he'd dealt with situations like this before. The kind of petty neighborhood disputes that made up far too much of a suburban police officer's day. "Good morning, folks," he said wearily. "I understand. There's some kind of parking dispute?" "Officer, thank goodness you're here," Karen immediately launched into her victim routine. "This man has been harassing me and trying to prevent me from parking in this public area. He's been very aggressive and threatening, and I'm genuinely concerned for my safety." Officer Rodriguez looked at me expectantly, and I took a deep breath before explaining the actual situation. I showed him my property deed, which I kept on my phone for situations exactly like this, pointed out the clear property markers, and explained that Karen had been parking on my lawn without permission. The officer examined the evidence, walked the property line, and confirmed what I already knew. Karen's SUV was clearly parked on private property. "Ma'am," he said to Karen, "this is definitely private property. You're going to need to move your vehicle." I expected this to be the end of it, but I had severely underestimated Karen's commitment to being wrong. Instead of apologizing or simply moving her car, she doubled down. "That's impossible," she declared. "Margaret told me this was public parking. Are you sure you're reading that deed correctly? Maybe the property lines have changed since it was written." Officer Rodriguez rubbed his temples in the universal gesture of someone dealing with a difficult person. "Ma'am, property deeds don't just change, and the markers are clearly visible. You need to move your car now." "I want to speak to your supervisor," Karen demanded. "This is clearly some kind of mistake, and I won't be treated like a criminal for parking in a legal spot." It took another 30 minutes and a call to the officer's supervisor before Karen finally, reluctantly, moved her SUV. But as she climbed into the driver's seat, she rolled down her window and leaned out to deliver what she clearly thought was a devastating parting shot. "This isn't over," she said, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at me. "I'm going to look into this whole situation, and when I prove that this is public land, you're going to owe me an apology, a big one." And with that, she drove off, leaving behind a set of deep tire tracks and the sinking realization that my quiet morning had just turned into something much more complicated. I spent the rest of that day researching Karen's claims, partly out of curiosity and partly out of a nagging worry that maybe, somehow, there was some obscure legal loophole I wasn't aware of. I called the city planning office, spoke with the tax assessor, and even contacted my homeowner's insurance company to double-check my coverage. Every single person I spoke with confirmed what I already knew. The land was mine, the boundaries were clear, and Karen had absolutely no right to park there. But my relief was short-lived. The next morning, I woke up to find Karen's SUV parked in the exact same spot, this time with a handwritten note tucked under her windshield wiper that read, "Public parking, authorized by City Ordinance 47B. I had no idea what City Ordinance 47B was, but I was pretty sure Karen had just made it up. Nevertheless, her brazen return to my lawn felt like a declaration of war. If she wanted to play games, I was ready to play. But I had a feeling this was going to get much worse before it got better. The tire tracks from her overnight parking were even deeper now, and I noticed that the recent rain had turned the damaged areas into muddy ruts that were going to be extremely difficult to repair. As I stood there surveying the damage, I realized that Karen wasn't just trespassing on my property, she was actively destroying it. And something told me this was only the beginning. What I didn't know was that Karen had been busy. Very busy. Over the next few days, she had apparently conducted what she called extensive research into my property situation, which mostly involved complaining to anyone who would listen at the local coffee shop and creating increasingly elaborate theories about municipal conspiracy. The real nightmare began during the third week of her unauthorized parking campaign. That's when the October rains started. Not just the gentle autumn showers that usually graced our neighborhood, but a relentless downpour that lasted for 5 straight days. The weather forecast called it a historic rainfall event, but I preferred to think of it as nature's way of revealing Karen's true character. You see, Karen's SUV was heavy, really heavy. And when you park a 5,000-pound vehicle on grass that's been saturated with rain for days, physics becomes your enemy. Each morning, I watched through my window as Karen struggled to extract her vehicle from what was rapidly becoming a swamp of her own making. The first morning was almost comical. I sipped my coffee and watched as Karen tried to back out of her self-created parking spot, her wheels spinning uselessly in the mud. The high-pitched whine of her tires fighting for traction was like music to my ears, especially when accompanied by the muffled sound of her frustrated cursing from inside the vehicle. But Karen was nothing if not persistent. Instead of admitting defeat, she called a tow truck. Not to remove her car from my property, that would have been too reasonable, but to pull her SUV out of the mud so she could continue parking there. "Ma'am," I heard the tow truck driver say as he surveyed the situation, "you might want to consider parking somewhere else. This lawn is completely torn up." "Nonsense," Karen replied, standing in the pouring rain with an umbrella that was doing absolutely nothing to help her cause. "This is public parking and I have every right to be here. Just get my car out." The tow truck driver, a weathered man named Joe who I later learned had been in the business for 20 years, looked at Karen like she had grown a second head. "Lady, I've seen some stubborn folks in my time, but this takes the cake. You're..." destroying this person's property. "It's not their property!" Karen shrieked, and I swear I could hear her voice crack with the strain of maintaining her delusion. "I've done my research, and this is clearly municipal land." Joe shook his head and hooked up her SUV, but before he left, he knocked on my door. "Sir," he said, "I don't know what's going on here, but that woman is completely nuts. She's turning your lawn into a mud pit, and she seems to think she has the right to do it." I explained the situation to Joe, who listened with the patience of someone who had seen every kind of human behavior imaginable. When I finished, he whistled low and shook his head. "You know what you need?" he said conspiratorially. "You need to make that mud pit so deep and so nasty that her fancy SUV can't get out. Mother Nature's already doing half the work for you." That conversation planted a seed of an idea that would eventually grow into something beautiful and terrible. The next morning, Karen's SUV was back, sitting in the same spot like a monument to human stubbornness. But this time, something was different. The rain had continued overnight, and the area where she'd been parking had transformed from damaged lawn into something that looked more like a small lake. The mud was no longer just soft. It was deep, thick, and had the consistency of chocolate pudding. Karen, however, was undeterred. I watched from my window as she climbed out of her vehicle, her designer shoes immediately sinking into the muck. She tried to maintain her dignity as she squelched across my lawn, but the effect was somewhat undermined by the fact that she was now carrying her shoes and walking barefoot through the mud. That's when I noticed something that made my heart sing with petty joy. Margaret, Karen's supposed friend from across the street, was standing in her doorway with her arms crossed, shaking her head in obvious disapproval. Curiosity got the better of me, so I decided to take a walk. As I approached Margaret's house, she called out to me. "I am so sorry about all this," she said, gesturing toward the disaster that had once been my front lawn. "I never told Karen she could park there. I have no idea why she keeps saying that." The plot thickened. "Really?" I asked, though I wasn't particularly surprised. "She seems pretty convinced that you gave her permission." Margaret sighed heavily. She asked me about parking when she first started visiting, and I told her there was street parking available. "I never said anything about your lawn. Honestly, I've been too embarrassed to say anything because I was the one who introduced her to the neighborhood book club. I feel responsible for this whole mess." This was an interesting development. Not only was Karen trespassing and destroying my property, but she was also lying about having permission to do so. I thanked Margaret for her honesty and headed back to my house, my mind racing with possibilities. That evening, I made a decision that would change everything. If Karen wanted to park on my lawn, I was going to make sure she had the full experience. I waited until after midnight, then crept out to my backyard shed and retrieved my garden hose. For the next 2 hours, I systematically watered the area where Karen had been parking. Not just a light sprinkling, I'm talking about a thorough, deliberate soaking that turned the already soft ground into something resembling a mud wrestling pit. I even went so far as to create little channels that would direct water flow toward the center of her preferred parking spot. The next morning was worth every minute of lost sleep. I positioned myself at my front window with a cup of coffee and waited for the show to begin. Karen arrived at exactly 8:30 a.m., as she had every morning for the past 3 weeks. But this time, when she tried to park, her SUV didn't just sink a little, it practically disappeared. The front wheels sank so deep into the mud that her bumper was nearly touching the ground. From my window, I could see Karen's face through her windshield, and the expression of absolute panic was priceless. She tried to reverse, but that only made things worse. The rear wheels spun uselessly, spraying mud in all directions and coating the back of her previously pristine silver SUV with a thick layer of brown sludge. For 20 minutes, Karen sat in her car, presumably trying to figure out how to extract herself from this predicament. When she finally opened her door, she was greeted by the sight of mud that came up to her ankles. Her first step out of the vehicle was a disaster. Her foot sank so deep that she lost her shoe entirely, and when she tried to retrieve it, she nearly fell face first into the muck. By this point, I wasn't the only one watching the show. Several neighbors had gathered to witness what was quickly becoming the most entertaining morning our quiet street had seen in years. Mrs. Henderson from next door was openly laughing, and even the usually serious Mr. Thompson from the corner house was grinning behind his newspaper. Karen, now covered in mud from the knees down, began a performance that would have made Shakespeare proud. She screamed, she cried, she demanded that someone help her, and she threatened to sue everyone within a 3-block radius. But the piece de resistance came when she called the police again. "This is harassment," she shrieked into her phone, her voice carrying across the entire neighborhood. "Someone has sabotaged this public parking area. This is attempted murder. I could have drowned in this mud." Officer Rodriguez arrived about 30 minutes later, and I could see him trying not to laugh as he surveyed the scene. Karen's SUV was now completely stuck, looking like some kind of modern art installation titled "Entitlement Meets Reality." Karen herself was a sight to behold, covered in mud, missing one shoe, and gesticulating wildly as she tried to explain how this was everyone's fault but her own. "Ma'am," Officer Rodriguez said patiently, "we've been through this before. This is private property and you're trespassing. The homeowner has every right to water their lawn." "I'm not trespassing," Karen insisted, but her voice had lost some of its earlier conviction. This is... Someone deliberately flooded this area to trap me." "Ma'am, it's been raining for a week, and you've been parking a heavy vehicle on grass. This is what happens when you ignore physics." The officer looked at me with barely concealed amusement. "Sir, I don't suppose you'd be willing to let us call another tow truck to get this vehicle out of here?" I pretended to consider this for a moment. "Well, I suppose I could allow that, but I'm concerned about the damage to my lawn. That truck is going to need to come onto my property to reach her car, and given the condition of the ground, it might cause even more damage." Officer Rodriguez nodded seriously. "That's a valid concern. Ma'am, your vehicle is stuck on private property that you've been damaging for weeks. The homeowner would be within his rights to press charges for trespassing and property damage." That's when Karen's facade finally cracked. The tears were real this time, not the crocodile tears she'd been using to try to manipulate people. She stood there in the mud, covered in filth, her expensive outfit ruined, her car trapped like a bug in amber, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, she seemed to understand that her actions had consequences. I just needed somewhere to park," she said quietly, her voice small and defeated. "Margaret said, I thought..." "Ma'am," Officer Rodriguez said, gently, "Margaret never gave you pee."